What's up everyone, Nader here. I'm super excited to start a new course with the new year here together. This is going to be a course about the DOM. So this might be a little bit strange for a lot of people. Usually what we would see is something like going into React or some HTML or CSS once we're trying to learn web development, given that we just learned a bunch of JavaScript. However, I think the DOM is probably one of those topics that is really not utilized enough when it comes to actually fundamental understanding of how the tools and technologies that we use every day as web developers actually works behind the scenes. So that's really the purpose of this series that we're going to go through together. We're going to look at the DOM, which is the document object model, also known as things like the browser DOM and things like that, where we're actually going to see really fundamentally how we can access and manipulate things like the web page and the content on it from languages like JavaScript together. So I'm super excited to actually get through this. I think if you have learned things like React or other frameworks, or even if you haven't yet, this is probably one of those tools and technologies that if you can learn, it's going to just make everything make so much more sense when you're looking at front end web development, because all of the frameworks that we use every single day, Angular, React, Vue, things like that, and anything that comes out in the future always has to work with the DOM behind the scenes anyways. There's also a bunch of new technologies that have come out related to the DOM that allow us to even kind of forego frameworks altogether and even make whole, very complicated, robust web pages with our own component system. So I'm super excited to kind of go through this entire series together. In this particular video, we're going to learn what the DOM is, why we need to learn it, what we can actually do with it, and then a little bit of tools and setup at the end to get us started so we can jump right into this in the next video together to start off the course. So without further ado, let's just actually get right to the content. Okay, so as with all the other videos, I just have a bunch of slides prepared. This is going to be more kind of slide heavy because I just want to really present the actual high level concepts before we start diving into kind of the minutiae of the details for this topic, because this concept of the DOM, if we can understand it at kind of the 50,000 foot view before diving in, it really helps contextualize where we're actually coming from, so that when we look at things like frameworks in the future, they just make a lot more sense. So what is the DOM? Right? Well, it's short for the document object model. Well, it's like, okay, Nader, thanks. That's like very helpful, right? So really what the DOM is it's a standardized interface that describes a web page. That's all it is, okay? It's just something that every single browser vendor, like web author has agreed upon as a standard as to what makes up a web page, how we can kind of change that web page, and the operations we can perform on web pages. Okay, so literally every framework, since this is a standard, can rely on this behind the scenes to actually manipulate what we see on the screen. Okay, now to understand the DOM, there are a few technologies and tools that are very useful and going to come in handy as we go through kind of this adventure together. So we're looking at this tool right here, which is the DOM, the document object model. We need to know a lot about the browser and kind of how browsers work. So what does that mean? Well, I'm sure you've used a browser every day, depending on what operating system or device you're using, probably something like Google Chrome or Safari or Firefox or Opera or whatever the hip browser is these days. You've probably used one, whether it's on a mobile device or your actual computer. Okay, we're going to be using the browser a lot throughout this actual series because everything that we're doing is manipulating the UI, which is what we actually see when we load up a web page. We also are going to be dealing with JavaScript a lot. So the previous series that we went through together was all about JavaScript in depth. And we pretty much covered like 95% of the things you'd ever see in JavaScript when working day to day. And those are fundamental vanilla JavaScript core tools that are going to actually help us in understanding how the DOM works, because we're going to be seeing things like closures and classes and functions and loops and all this kind of stuff that is all just JavaScript. Okay, now I'll mention in this video, as you'll see later, that there's more to the DOM than just JavaScript, but it's going to be the tool that we are going to use to actually access the DOM in this particular series, because that's just generally what we use on the web, on the front end anyways. Then we're going to look at HTML and CSS. So if you're kind of looking at this and being like, oh my gosh, Nader, like I'm not very good at HTML, or I'm definitely not very good at CSS, you're not alone. In fact, my CSS, like I can't even style myself out of a box. All right. So don't worry. Honestly, don't worry about CSS. Also, don't really worry about HTML. To be completely frank with you, once you learn the DOM, we're going to be learning HTML and a bit of CSS as we go along with it, just kind of as cursory knowledge, as like a byproduct of working with the DOM, because we can actually do everything in HTML and CSS using the DOM interfaces, which is really the power behind what the DOM actually is. So we're not going to be writing like a whole bunch of HTML and CSS throughout this series, just enough to actually get things working so we can actually create web pages. In fact, hopefully towards the end of the series, what we'll see is we don't actually have to write any HTML or CSS pretty much. We can actually create entire web pages in just JavaScript, which actually is exactly how frameworks like React actually work. If you think about it, we don't actually write HTML or CSS in something like React. We're actually just writing JavaScript that creates the actual web page for us. Okay, so don't worry about HTML and CSS too much. Really, we're going to be focusing on the core JavaScript kind of methods, a little bit of browser tools that we'll see shortly, and learning this concept of the DOM. So just kind of at the back of your mind, when you hear the DOM, these are some things, visuals I'd like you to have at the back of your mind, okay? So this picture here on the left, this is a very boring boxes and lines drawing. Effectively, it's like an inverted tree structure, okay? So we have some nodes, and then those have some children nodes, and then those have some children nodes, and etc., 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 until there's no more kind of children anymore left, okay? I feel like there's a very kind of interesting story in there somewhere, but we'll just keep going with this analogy. So this really is what the DOM is. Like once we work more and more with the DOM, we'll see that it is just this. It's basically a way for us to interface with this right here. Okay. Now a more visual and fun way to think about it is really what I have here on the right. And this is just kind of a basic, just like web page and just the different components on that web page, right? So, you know, maybe we have a hero, or we have a header, and we have like a card and it has a title and an image, and maybe we have a paragraph. Maybe we have a footer, or a footer is over here, I guess. Some sharing buttons or whatever it happens to be. So all of these are different components on a web page. And these are all structured in a very particular way. Also, they're structured relative to each other. In fact, they're actually all structured relative to kind of one single parent or root component, which we'll see as well. All right, so just keep this visual at the back of your mind as we're going through this DOM concept, because it's going to come in very handy to kind of add a bit more context, because some of this stuff, it's you kind of lose the context and you kind of get caught in the weeds if you forget the visuals. So why should we learn the DOM in the first place? Like, why is this important? Why am I so kind of gung-ho about being like, learn the DOM, right? Like, don't go into React or Angular, whatever it is. Like, just learn the DOM first and then move to those tools and technologies, right? Like, why am I so adamant about it? Well, I'll give you a few reasons, and you'll see hopefully over the course of this series why it really is the right way to go. Now, the first important thing is it's really just a web standard, okay? I know I keep harping on this, but it's so important. And as you become kind of better at development and kind of get into like senior developments and start making decisions for stacks and technologies that you use for entire projects eventually, hopefully that you'll end up leading, you're going to have to make decisions on technologies that you actually use for those projects. Now, personally, I'm a huge proponent of web standard technologies. That means things that are literally like not proprietary, so some company didn't build them. They are basically open source standards that have been agreed upon by everyone to incorporate into the web. Now, there's a lot of open source tools that have come out recently that make it really easy to work with web standards, but at its core, there are also non-web standard tools. I'm going to always promote the web standard tools because we can be guaranteed that if we use something that is a web standard, it will never ever break. Something will never change in it that will break our website. The beauty of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript as standards is that even a website that was coded at the dawn of the internet era, right, in the 90s or even in the 80s, I guess, like in the Netscape kind of days, if you even know which that browser is, then those websites still actually work today. Okay, that is totally mind-blowing. If you really sit and you think about that for a moment, that's truly amazing. Websites that were built like 30 years ago still work in our browsers today because all of the standards have just evolved, but we haven't broken things and everything remains backwards compatible. So super important, and I'll keep mentioning things about this as we kind of go further into this topic. As well, the DOM is really the fundamental building block of a website. Okay, especially as we get to things like web components, hopefully later in the series. Really, at the end of the day, a website is just a bunch of blocks of components that are structured relative to each other in a particular way. And if we can add to them, update them, delete them, or add chunks of them into the web page at a time, that really is just a website. We can say, hey, add a new picture at this section, or add a new post, or add a new card, or whatever it happens to be. And that really is just manipulating this idea of a DOM. The other thing that's important is that, which we'll see again shortly, is this idea of a DOM I mentioned is not pure just JavaScript. Okay, it's actually cross-language. It is not JavaScript, but we can access it through JavaScript as well as many other languages because it's just a standardized interface. So we'll see shortly things like Python and other languages can actually access the DOM as long as they have libraries that access that standard. It's also cross-platform. So if you're on a Mac or a PC or Linux, or you're on an iOS or Android device, or you're even accessing this from, I don't know, like your car's web browser if you have one of those these days, or your fridge if it's a smart fridge, or your washing machine if it has a little interface for web browsing. I'm not sure why you'd have one of those, but just assume you do. It would all work just fine because it's a web standard and it's cross-platform and totally compatible as long as the tool that you're using, the browser, adheres to those standards. All frameworks that we're ever going to use, both now and in the future, are built on the DOM. Okay, if you dig into the React code, if you dig into the Vue.js code, or whichever framework, whatever the hip framework of the day is, right, it's always going to be building on top of the DOM. The general concept, like reason why these frameworks exist, is that there are things that are a bit tricky with the DOM, and they've gotten easier over time, and they've been really made these frameworks to make it easier to work with the DOM. Now we have things like web components and all that kind of stuff these days that arguably makes that not as necessary. So the frameworks are trying to innovate and do other things, and the DOM always eventually catches up to some degree. So at the end of the day, everything is just built on DOM anyways. And that said, with that as a fact, when we actually learn the DOM, we get a lot of insight and understanding into how the higher level abstractions or libraries actually work. So when you're working with the DOM and you're building out everything manually, and then you go over to technology, say like React, and you start building tools with React and web pages with React, at the back of your mind, you can say, oh, okay, I think I understand what React is doing here behind the scenes, and I can see how it's actually interfacing with the DOM, right? So even if I was to build my own little mini React, I could probably like generally think about it, right? Now there's a lot of optimizations and a lot of crazy fancy stuff they do behind the scenes, but at a fundamental level, it's really not that bad if you really boil it down to what it's doing behind the scenes. So I would argue that the DOM should be a prerequisite to learning front-end tools and frameworks like React and like Vue and like Angular, right? And if you've already learned those languages or frameworks, that's fine, but I would highly encourage you to really go deep with the DOM, because what you'll notice is that when you go back to those tools, you'll be like, oh, okay, that makes so much more sense, like what is happening over here and how they're doing it. It becomes less magical and mystical about what those frameworks are doing, and you kind of get an appreciation for how those tools are actually built by the authors, and maybe you can even contribute to their source code, which would be totally awesome. Okay, so let's take a look at what this whole DOM thing is. I've been kind of walking around this the whole time. So to really understand the DOM, we need to understand what it's not. Okay. Now, this is something that I'm very passionate about because I think it's so fundamentally misunderstood that it actually ends up confusing even seasoned JavaScript developers. Okay. Now, let's go through this slowly because it's so important. We have the DOM, okay, which is this middle blue section right here. The DOM really is what structure the web page has, as well as the different components of that structure. So when we're thinking about the DOM, we can think of ideas like the document. If you've ever done like documents.query selector or get element by ID or whatever, that is all part of the DOM. We have nodes and we have elements. So every time you get, for example, an item by ID or a query selector, you're actually getting back a node or an element, and that's part of the DOM. We have events. Every time you do like an on-click event or like a mouse over event, those are all interfaces that are part of the DOM because they deal with the structure and the content on the page, as well as the actual elements that make up that structure. Okay. Now, what is the DOM not? Okay. The DOM is not JavaScript. All right. We've learned JavaScript already. And if you haven't seen that series or you want a refresher on some of the concepts of what is JavaScript, we have an entire series, JavaScript in depth, that goes through that. But JavaScript is things like the objects and arrays and functions, maps, sets, generators, all that kind of fun stuff that goes into just the language of JavaScript. Now, notice that document is not part of JavaScript. Okay, when we were learning Node.js, for example, we couldn't just log out document. It would just say undefined. There's no such thing as document in JavaScript. It only exists in the browser because it's part of the DOM, and it gives us access to that through JavaScript as one possibility. So we'll see that because it's a little bit confusing, and these things get so often mixed up that it's actually kind of sad, really, because there's such fundamental technologies that are so different from each other, but they work so well together that a lot of people assume they're the same thing. Now, there's this other set of tools, and kind of generally these are called the BOM, B-O-M. And you're probably thinking that I'm trolling you when I say this, but this is short for the browser object model. Now, that's a bit of an older terminology. Generally, these days, what people really mean when they say the BOM, it's hilarious, I can't stop laughing when I say that, is web APIs. Okay, so I'll actually show you what I mean in a second. But these are a whole different set of APIs, tools, technologies that come with the web in general. Not always the browser, because these can actually be implemented in things like Node and Dino and other backend frameworks, for example, to some degree. But they're just general standardized APIs that happen to work also in the browser for the most part. In fact, a lot of these are pretty much exclusive to the browser, sort of, like, for example, the navigator, where we can like move back and forward and things like that. The location, we can get like the URL, the page, local storage, we can like store stuff in the browser, etc., etc. But they are not unique to the browser. We can do these things technically on the back end if we want. And in fact, a lot of these are on the back end in newer tools like Dino. For example, like Crypto and the Fetch API are on the back end as well. Okay, so just to show you what I mean, if you pull up your browser really quick, I'd like you to pull up Google. And I just want you to search web APIs, okay? And if you do that, hopefully what you'll get is, a Google search page like this. And I'd like you to go to my favorite documentation, which is MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network documentation. They should have a page on the web API. So you click on that and you'll load that up. And let me zoom in a little bit on this. And what this is basically what I just talked about, the BOM or the web APIs. Okay, now you scroll through this is a giganto list of stuff. Okay, and we're not going to go through all these, of course. However, we could probably make a mini series on all these. In fact, I probably will at some point, or at least like a short or something on some of these, because they're so cool and so important to how kind of we use the web day to day. But these are not part of the DOM. And these are not part of JavaScript. These are just separate standardized APIs that we can use in the browser, but also technically in other places if it makes sense. Okay, Perfect. So let's head back here. So one interesting thing you probably noticed is at the very top of this, I had something called the window object. Okay, and now this is unique to the browser because things like Node.js, for example, don't have a window object. But in the browser, we have the window object, and then we have attached to the window object everything that we can do in that environment. So in this case, in the browser environment, where the root object of everything is window, but we have access to all the web APIs off of it, which I just showed you, that huge list. We have things like the navigator and fetch. We have the DOM on there. So we have like events and the document. So window.document, for example. And then we have JavaScript. So we have all of the JavaScript core kind of objects and classes and things like that as part of the window object as well. And we can access them globally as just part of this environment that we're working in, which is the browser. Okay, so just keep that in mind, and I'll show you a little bit of this as we go along, and it'll become more and more apparent. The key here, takeaway, is that these are separate tools and separate technologies and ideas. We have the web APIs, we have the DOM, which we're learning in this particular series, and then we have JavaScript, which is its own entire language and set of tools, which we've already looked at previously. Okay, so why do we even have this DOM thing? Right? Like what's really the purpose? Well, if you take that kind of middle slice that I just showed you, we have the document, node, etc., etc. That's the DOM. Now, we in this series are going to be accessing the DOM through JavaScript, right? Because that's generally the easiest way to do it, especially in something like the browser and other things like maybe Node.js or Dino or whatever it happens to be. And using that, we can get that language-specific representation of the DOM. So for example, in JavaScript, we have access to the document object, which has everything related to the DOM inside of it. So we can do like document.body, and we can get the body tag of the DOM and everything inside it if we want. We can create events, we can create elements, we can do all sorts of fun stuff. However, it's not exclusive to JavaScript. So this is where it gets really cool. We can actually access the DOM because it's just a standardized interface from any language that has a set of tools or libraries to actually understand it. So for example, in Python, we can create something that can talk to a DOM, right? For example, one really fun thing to do in Python is to do web scraping. So you can actually go to a web page and you can download the entire web page. You can parse it out into a DOM object, which is very similar to an object in JavaScript. And you can actually grab items out of it, but inside of the Python programming language, which obviously has nothing to do with JavaScript, right? And the reason is that this DOM is a standard. No matter which language you try to access it from, everything is standardized so that that language, as long as it has a set of tools, it can actually read all of this data and actually do whatever you want with it within that language, as long as someone makes a library to talk to this DOM. Okay, so this works for any language. In fact, pretty much most languages have some kind of libraries or several libraries that will actually talk to a DOM or create a DOM and manipulate a DOM for us. And you can use these for like web servers, for web scraping, for all sorts of super fun things. Okay, and this language-specific representation is inside the language that you're working in. So if I did this in Python or did this in Java, I would actually be able to change and manipulate that DOM within Java, for example. Right, which just for your information, if you haven't seen before, is totally different from JavaScript. Okay, so what can we do with this DOM? So once we have it, that's great. Like once we can access it, great, that's awesome. But like, what is the point of it? Like, what can we actually do with it, right? Well, here are a couple of things, and we're going to try to go through all of these in this series. We can do all of what are called the CRUD operations. So create, read, update, and delete. So we can create HTML, CSS, we can grab the existing HTML, CSS, we can update it, we can also delete entire bits of HTML and CSS, right? So we can do things like add a new image to the page, we can delete images from the page, we can grab all the paragraphs from the page and make them all bold, right? We can do all sorts of really cool stuff because we really have access to the entirety of what's on the screen from the DOM methods. We can change attributes of elements on a page. So if you've studied a little bit of HTML, you know that each HTML element can have these things called attributes. For example, something like an ID or a class or a style or whatever it happens to be, we can actually change those, access them, delete them, and add them all from these DOM interfaces, right? Directly, which is pretty cool. We can do the same things, all these CRUD operations, with events that are on a page, right? So if you think of like an on-click event or a mouse over event or a scroll event, we can change all of these or add them or remove them or change what happens, the functions that run when those things get triggered, all through these DOM interfaces. In fact, there's a dedicated set of APIs, is what it's called, or functions that we can use to actually do exactly this. We can actually even create our own custom events. So we're not actually limited to the ones that come with HTML, right? So for example, onClick is one that comes with HTML. When something gets clicked, we can run some function or run some code. We can create our own custom version of events that don't actually exist in regular HTML and JavaScript. And we can actually do whatever we want, call them whatever we want, and run whatever code that we want, which is pretty awesome. Similarly, we can also create our own custom elements. So there are the existing elements like a p tag and a table and all that kind of stuff, h1 and headers. We can create our own custom version of those, like say a card or a hero, right? And we can put those into the HTML and actually have it display exactly that thing, very similar to how you would do in something like React, where you can build out an entire kind of subset with its own mini DOM, right? Like a shadow DOM, for example, which we'll also hopefully learn in the series. And we can actually just shove it into a page as if it was just another regular element like another p tag, which is totally awesome. It's just like so cool to actually see that happen. And it's super, super fun. I can't wait to get to that topic. There's so much more, frankly, that the DOM can do. MDN, which is my favorite documentation that I just showed you, has a whole bunch of stuff on what you can do to the DOM, all the different interfaces. We're gonna go through most of them, at least the most common ones that can actually get us up and running, that really sets us up for things like frameworks when we get to things like React. But really, once we actually go through this, you'll probably wonder, hey, do we even really need that, right? Can we just build stuff in web components or something? Do we even need a tool like React? Which is actually a fantastic question to be able to even ask, because a lot of people will just default to that and think that that's the only way to build websites, when in fact it's only a relatively new way. And there are many other ways to build websites that are actually just totally standardized and part of the actual web interface already. Okay, so kind of to finish this up, I just want to kind of go through a bit of the tools and a little bit of setup just to kind of get us into a right place and just give you a small demo of something as well. So what are we going to be using throughout this entire series? It's relatively simple. We're going to be using a code editor or a text editor called Visual Studio Code. Hopefully you have that installed. If you don't, I have another video on the channel that kind of goes through the installation process for VS Code, and I can link that. Also, ideally you have a browser. Ideally it's Google Chrome because it has a lot of really great features that we can actually use, and I'll show you a couple of them. But really any browser is going to work as long as you're comfortable with it and it has the tools that I'm going to show you. So I'm going to use Chrome in this course, but you can use things like Firefox, you can use Safari if you want. It doesn't really matter that much. Just have a browser that you're used to. And if you're struggling with that one and it doesn't work out the way that I'm showing you, then just use Chrome or something similar to it. I have another tool on here. Now, this is a very small tool relative to these other ones, but I do want to put it on here because it's so important to reduce the frustration and friction that you'll see, because one of the most annoying things when you're writing code is having to format it correctly. So I'll actually show you how to install Prettier. So when we're writing HTML, for example, you don't have to worry about lining everything up, because frankly, that's just a waste of time and super annoying, especially when you just want to actually see stuff work. Okay, and that's going to be called Prettier, and I'll show you how we can install that. Okay, so let's kind of switch over to VS Code, and I'll show you what that tool looks like. And I'm actually going to install Prettier and show you how that works so that you can actually get it to actually format your code immediately, which is pretty awesome. So I'm going to pull up VS Code, and again, if you don't have this, I have a video on the channel as to how you can install this, but this is effectively what you'll generally see. I encourage you to always open a folder and then work in that folder. So I'm going to be creating files kind of over here on the left-hand side, and then I'll be editing the content and the text in this main editor section. In the other videos in JavaScript, we actually use the terminal, which I generally have open on the right-hand side, but we're actually not going to use the terminal in this set of videos because we're going to be running all this code on a web browser instead. Previously, we were running code in Node.js, but we're not going to be using Node.js throughout this series because the DOM is really all about, at least the way that we're approaching it to start, the front end. We can access the DOM from Node or from any other backend, but to start and really understand it, it makes most sense to actually work on it in the browser. Okay, so let's go ahead and actually install Prettier to start, because once you have VS Code open, that generally doesn't come bundled with it. So on the left-hand side, you should see a bunch of buttons. I'm just going to go to the extensions section over here, which is the one with the blocks. And I already have it installed, but I'll search for it. It's called Prettier, just like that. Once you search for that, it should be the one in the top, which says Prettier Code Formatter. I'll click on it. Looks like this. It has a whole bunch of downloads. I already have it installed, as I mentioned, so you'll see an install button if you don't have it. Just click on that. It'll take a second to start up. And once you have it installed, that's great. We're just going to do a couple of things. So what you want to do is you want to create a new file. I'm just going to call this intro.html. Okay, make sure you have the .html on the actual file name. And what we want to do is we want to just do some HTML in here, just like that. So we have a regular HTML tag. Maybe you can put a head tag in here if you want. And maybe you can put inside here, I'm just gonna add a body tag right after this. So after the head tag, I'm gonna add a body tag, and you can see it's closing for me. I'll put an H1 in here, and I'll just do hello. All right. Now what we're gonna be doing throughout this course is we're gonna be opening this in our browser by just double clicking on it. So I'm going to show you how to actually open this file next. So if you're on Windows, this will look slightly different than if you're on a Mac or a PC or Linux, I should say. But generally, I hope all of you know how to open up your kind of file system. If you're struggling with that, definitely let me know in the comments and I can do my best to help you out. But once you kind of figure out where your actual code is or this HTML file is, you want to actually navigate to it. This might be a bit small, but I'm not going to focus on this part. What you want to do is you want to double click on it, okay? And it'll open up in your default browser. So if you don't have Chrome set up as your default browser, I'd encourage you to kind of do this for this series at least, or just use another browser if you're used to that. But if I double click on this, what's gonna happen is it's gonna open up in my Google Chrome, and I'll just zoom in on that nicely. And we can see that we have hello, which is what we wrote in our H1 tag. Okay, so again, that was very quick. If you're looking at this and you're just being like, oh my gosh, like I don't know anything about what's happening, don't worry at all. Honestly, we're gonna go through this kind of step by step and really build this up over time. We're not gonna go into detail in HTML because there's many other great tutorials on that, but we're gonna get enough into it that you're not gonna have to worry too much about what's happening. We're gonna be focusing on the actual DOM concepts, all right? So that's gonna be the workflow generally. But to get back to Prettier, just so that we can actually get this formatted, because if you don't have it installed, what's going to happen is that you probably saw that this kind of moved around and stuff like that, right? So if I save the file, you can see how it jumps kind of like that, and maybe I can move these things around like this. And this would be really annoying to have to fix manually. If I save my file, you can see it jumps back into place. The way to actually get this working is to, on a Mac, it's Command-Shift-P. On a PC, it should be Control-Shift-P. If I do that, you'll get this dialog box that opens up. I'm going to type format into this box, and the option that we're going to be looking for, let me see if I can zoom in on this a little bit more, is the one that says format document with. Okay, so make sure it's not format document. We want to do format document with. If I click on that, you'll see I have a few options here. I know it's tempting to click Prettier, which is what we just installed. If you don't see Prettier in here, by the way, I'd encourage you to restart VS Code. So just kind of close it and reopen it, and hopefully you'll see it in here. But we want to configure our default formatter. When you click on that, then you can click on Prettier. Okay, and what that's going to do is it's going to make it so that every time we have an HTML document, Prettier is set up to be the formatter. You can see here in the bottom right, I have Prettier as a formatter for HTML. All right, now to have it actually do what I did, which is every time you save the file, it changes, because if you do this again, you do format document with. If you don't do configure default formatter and you just do Prettier like this, what's going to happen is just going to do that one time. Okay, so every time you change the code, you're going to have to format it, change the code, format it, which is super annoying. So I'm going to show you another fun technique to use. I'm going to do Command-Shift-P again, or Control-Shift-P. I'm going to search for user settings. Okay, and we're going to have a couple of options here. I'm going to open the one that says preferences, open user settings, not the one that says JSON. So the one that says no JSON, I'm going to have settings like this. I want you to search for format on save. Okay, and you can see that I have it checked off. This is the thing that makes it trigger the formatter that we just installed, which is Prettier, every time we save the file. So if you check it off, and then you come back on here and you save the file, you should see it kind of zoop into place. And you can do that for JS files if you want, or CSS files as well. And I have it set up generally for most of my files. Now there's other ways to make this work, but for this series is probably the easiest and best way. Generally, when you're working on a team, this might get a bit annoying, so you might want to turn it off and actually use the configuration file, which is what they recommend. But as you're learning, that's actually more annoying than it's worth. So I would just go with this method. All right, so let's go back to our web browser here really quick. And I just want to show you kind of a little bit of what I mean when it comes to the DOM. So when we're using Google Chrome in this case, if you right click anywhere on a web page, and we're going to test many different web pages over time as we learn this concept. But if you scroll down in this menu to the inspect, which is usually on the bottom, I know this is very tiny, but it says inspect on my screen. Sometimes it says inspect element. You're going to have pop up this kind of screen on the right hand side. These are what's called the developer tools for Google Chrome in this case. Firefox and Safari have ones that are very similar, and most of the browsers do. But again, I'm going to stick with Chrome. Now, there are many different tabs along the top. I'm super zoomed in so you can actually see this properly. But if you're also zoomed in, you can click on this little right-hand arrow, and we're going to go through a bunch of these over time. But we're really going to be sticking to elements and then the console for the first little while. Eventually, we might look at things in here as well. But if you kind of hover your mouse over some of these, what you'll see is some things kind of trigger on the screen. Okay, and in fact, what we can do is you can see there's an arrow beside this body. We can actually open it up, and you can see that now I see my H1 in here, which is what I typed. And if I hover over it, it shows that exact H1. Okay, and this is really where we're going to be spending most of our time as we're building out our web pages and learning about the DOM, both in here as well as this console over here. Okay, so this is going to be the Elements tab, where we're going to be able to actually inspect and look at the different parts of our DOM. And there's the styles down here and listeners and all that kind of fun stuff that we'll get to as part of the series. And over here beside it is usually the console, where we can actually write some JavaScript and actually test what's happening. For example, if you type document in here and you press enter, you'll see that it actually gives us back the document object, which is this entire thing right here from the DOM. And you can see that that's exactly what we just looked at in the Elements tab. Okay, and if we look at the window object, for example, you can see that that's what I mentioned earlier. And all of this stuff in here, you can see how crazy long this is part of that window object, right? And you can see that crypto, which is a web API, is on there. There's a whole bunch of fun stuff on here. It depends on which browser you're using. Some browsers support some of these APIs and some don't. But you see that document is one of these things, which is what we just looked at, which is our actual document object that we actually pulled out. So we're going to go really deep into this as we progress through this series. I just wanted to actually get the setup done and a general explanation out of the way so that everyone is on the same page, because really at the end of the day, what we want to do is work with the web page that we have in front of us, be able to add, change it, update it, and even make it easier to work with over time as we learn more tools and technologies that are DOM specific. And then we can actually have it be interactive by adding things like events and all that kind of fun stuff as we get more advanced. Okay, and really at the end of the day, you're going to see that this is very similar to technologies like React and Angular, which are kind of the de facto tools for web development these days. And you can really start to compare and contrast the differences between the regular DOM and these other new tools that actually work on the DOM behind the scenes. Okay, so I hope that this was an interesting intro and useful for you and really highlighted the major differences and kind of the way that we're going to progress in this series together. It was super fun to make this one. What we're going to do in the next video is actually jump right into the DOM itself. We're going to be looking at a little bit of HTML, a little bit of CSS and things like the window and the document, and just kind of getting our fingers right into this elements tab and a bit of the console just to actually get our kind of feet wet per se before we start diving into really specific topics regarding the different parts of the DOM. And as usual, we're going to be actually working through a bunch of exercises together as we learn each topic, just so that we can really start to cement that knowledge. I hope you found this video valuable. If you did, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to hear in the comments, what did you think of this intro? What do you think of the topic of learning about the DOM in general? Do you think it's interesting? Did you think it is what it actually is? Did you think it was something else? And specifically, I'm actually really interested, what do you think about the idea of the DOM versus just vanilla JavaScript? Did you think that they were actually the same thing when I kind of highlighted it there on that visual? Did that help a little bit to help understand what's actually happening? And kind of, have you even used this maybe in other languages other than just JavaScript? So until that next video, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.